Good evening, everybody. Some familiar faces, some not so familiar. How many, show of hands, have been to a Driftless Dialogue talk before? So a good handful, but also a good handful of newbies. If you didn't get a chance or didn't take a moment, there is a sign-up sheet out on the snack table, refreshment table. So stop by there if you didn't already and tell us who you are and give us your email so we can keep you apprised of future talks. My name's Scott Walter. I'm the relatively new executive director here at the Kickapoo Valley Reserve, and I'm excited to introduce our speaker tonight. This is, as you know, most of you know, this is part of our Driftless Dialogue series. It's free to the public, thanks to a grant from the Ralph Nuzum Kickapoo Valley Reforestation Fund through the University of Wisconsin Extension and our Friends of the Kickapoo Valley Reserve Group, who do so much for us here on the reserve. So thanks to them. Welcome again, everybody. Just one quick note. I am really excited by the topic of tonight's talk, and I was sharing with Mark real briefly that I didn't understand why, because I live just south of here, down near Viola, and I've got a half a dozen neighbors, very good friends who are Amish. So I've engaged with them weekly, and it's just always been part of our life down there on the farm. So when I saw this talk, I was like, "Ooh, who are the Amish?" I can understand that. And I thought, why is that so appealing to me? I live with these folks. It dawned on me, even though we relate as neighbors, I don't really dive into their belief systems or culture. I don't ask questions. We just sort of talk about day-to-day life. And I'm really excited to learn maybe a little bit more about my neighbors, their background, what brought them to Wisconsin, how they live their lives day-to-day, etc. But Erica, can I tell one quick story? I love this story. So one of those neighbors, Amish neighbors, Titus and Viola Yoder run a farm, right, or run a store right near Sugar Grove. You folks know where Sugar Grove is? Right above our farm. And we go up there, we do a lot of shopping, and we've gotten to know Titus and Viola and their daughters really well over the years. I pulled in a little over a year ago, parked at the store, got out of my truck, and I heard Titus yell from the porch of their house. He said, "Scott, come on up and visit for a bit." And I looked, and Titus and Viola were out there with a couple of their daughters, and I walked over, and as I'm stepping up on the porch, Titus looks at me and he goes, "You want a beer?" And I looked at him and he said, "Because if you do, you came to the wrong place." So it's kind of a little bit of the humor, but part of the relationship we have. But at any rate, beyond that story, we're gonna, I think, learn a lot more about the Amish tonight. Our speaker is Mark Louden, who's a professor of Germanic, linguistics, and religious studies at UW-Madison. So I'll just pass the baton, Mark.
All right, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for coming this evening. I love doing outreach presentations, and I've been doing it for several years. But as you can well imagine, I haven't been doing too many in-person events over the last, going on 2 years. So this is the second time that I'm out in person, and I'm extremely happy to be that way. I'm going to have my mask off this evening. I am fully vaccinated, booster and all that sort of stuff. But I think it'd just be easier for me to project, with my mask off. So that's what I'll be doing this evening. Although at the university, we're teaching in person, but with masks on. So I've gotten used to sort of like shouting through my mask. But for teaching languages, it doesn't really work all that well, right? Not to be able to see the mouths. But in any case, I'm going to be sharing with you some general an overview of who the Amish are, including with a little bit about the Amish in this area and in Wisconsin more generally. And I want to make sure that I leave enough time at the end so that I can take any questions that you might have, because I can anticipate a lot of the topics that people are going to be interested in, questions that people are going to have about the Amish, but obviously I can't read minds, and there's so many different questions that people have about the Amish that I really want to make sure that we have a chance to address any questions that you might have. So my task this evening really is to dispel a lot of misunderstandings about the Amish, because as The Amish are really familiar, actually. You know, they're the total population of the Amish in the United States and Canada, and they really only live in the US and Canada. They're only in North America now, although their roots go back to Switzerland and the Rhineland area of Germany and eastern France. The Amish, population is about 350,000, which is a tiny drop in the bucket when you consider sort of the general US and Canadian population. But the Amish are pretty much everywhere in terms of people's perceptions. And people that live far away from places like Western Wisconsin, where there's a large Amish presence, it seems like everybody's heard of the Amish or seen something about the Amish. And the Amish have been really on America's cultural map going back about 150 years. So it was about in the 1870s, 1880s, when American media, and at that time, of course, it was just print media, so it was like newspapers and magazines, started to write articles about who the Amish were. And at that point, there were fewer than 2,000 Amish, right, in the United States, almost all of them concentrated in eastern states, so like Pennsylvania, Ohio, and then a little bit in the Midwest toward Indiana. But much more recently on things like so-called reality TV shows, and I'm calling them so-called, because they're on TV, but there's not a whole lot of reality with those TV shows. The Amish, among a lot of other groups, have been the subject of curiosity in these shows. Amish Mafia and Breaking Amish are the two most familiar, and in some ways the two most infamous. These are shows that do not have Amish people in them at all. In other words, the cast are not Amish. There are some people who grew up in Amish families, but are not actual members of the Old Order Amish Church. And they're completely scripted, it's fantasy. It doesn't say anything really about everyday life among the Amish. It's basically a way to attract viewers and advertising revenue and to make money for the companies that produce these. But the program Amish Mafia was not only so way off the mark, but it was actually quite disturbing in many ways to a lot of Amish people, because the premise of that show was that there was this kind of a vigilante group or a sort of a guardian angel type group among the Amish young people who were living in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is the largest Amish settlement, one of the oldest and largest in America, in the Lancaster County settlement, and that this vigilante group was sort of charged with kind of protecting their own, right? So going around fending off threats, physical threats to Amish that lived in rural Lancaster County. And they were doing it with things like a sawed-off shotgun, which you see at the far right of this thing here. Now, this is not only something completely false and unrealistic, it's antithetical to the Amish Christian faith. Because the Amish, like Mennonites, I'm a Mennonite myself, and our related churches, we're also called peace churches, right? Our churches practice nonviolence, so not just pacifism, but actual nonviolence, which means that you are not permitted to engage in any kind of violence, including defensive violence. You can defend yourself in terms of like running away and protecting yourself, but you may not meet violence with violence. And that's exactly what the premise of this show was. So these shows are both off the air now, but what they did was kind of perpetuate a lot of misunderstandings and stereotypes about Amish, and specifically about Amish young people. There's this sort of fascination with Amish young people and kind of youth gone wild. A little bit more tasteful, but still no more accurate, are the plethora of not so-called bodice rippers, but what they call jokingly bonnet rippers. Sort of harlequin romances written for mainly Christian readership. So there's not a whole lot of sex, right, and passion, but it's nonetheless exoticized. And so these are stories where it's, the typical sort of thing where it's like, the beautiful young girl that can't find love, and then finally some Prince Charming comes. The Prince Charming may be a Mennonite, somebody coming from outside the Amish community, or it could be somebody who happens to be Amish himself. But the premise is pretty much the same as what you would find in a lot of other romance novels. But think about it. If you were to formulate opinions about a group of people, a culture, on the basis of romance novels written about them, you still wouldn't get a very accurate picture, right? So even though Amish people have romance and love each other, life is not nearly as racy and exciting as what you would find in these novels. But these novels are incredibly popular. I do a lot of presentations to community libraries, and I talk to the librarians and say, any interest in the Amish? They say, oh yeah, boy, these Amish novels, they just fly off the shelves. And it's only been like about 15 years now that there's really been sort of a large number of these novels. And basically every year the number is like doubling in terms of the novels that are available. It's really, really popular genre. Now, much more recently, and kind of appropriate to the pandemic that we're still in, is that the Amish have been sort of, let's say, lightning rods for curiosity about things that have to do with social issues in America, including political issues. And this is something that we can maybe talk about in the discussion, but going back to the presidential election of not 2020, but 2016, there was a political action committee that was started by supporters of Donald Trump, who aimed to enlist the support of Amish people for Republican Party, and specifically Donald Trump, looking rather cleverly at where Amish are concentrated in large numbers. So places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, swing states, right? And so there are a lot of misunderstandings that are out there and beliefs that somehow that the Amish swung the election for the Republicans on the national level in 2016. That is also something that is completely demonstrably false, right? This is something that's been researched by people who know about voting patterns and looking at turnout and that sort of thing. And the Amish generally do not participate in national elections at all. And the participation rate in the 2016 election was no higher than it had been in the past, which was a tiny fraction of the bucket. So there was nothing in terms of like swinging Pennsylvania or Ohio to the Republicans. And now more recently, the Amish, and this is something I won't get into too much in the presentation itself, but if you have interest, we can follow up the whole status of the Amish people as far as the pandemic goes. They've also been sort of kind of co-opted by political forces in terms of advancing a particular view about the pandemic and things like masks and vaccinations. Now, the reality about the Amish is still somewhat paradoxical. And this image here is actually not something that is from reality TV or staged or something. These are two young Amish women from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, whose image was taken without their knowledge, probably. And this is the cover image of one of the best books that's out there about the Amish. It's called The Riddle of Amish Culture. And it's written by a gentleman named Don Craybill, who's also a Mennonite and was known sort of as like the dean of Amish Studies. Amish Studies is a network of scholars and members of the public who have a curiosity about the Amish from an objective point of view. And as I say, the title of the book was The Riddle of Amish Culture. And this image evokes that very, very nicely because sort of from the thighs up, you'd say, okay, two young Amish women, but then from the thighs down, you say, oh, wait, what are they doing there? They're not supposed to be able to do that. I was like, why not? What's the problem? I said, well, they're wearing, rollerblades. Amish don't wear rollerblades. Amish are supposed to be frozen in time, like something out of the 1800s. Well, Amish people change. They have to change in order to be able to survive, right? Amish life today is rather different than it was 50 years ago and quite different than it was 100 and 150 years ago. And part of the secret of the Amish success, right? The fact that the Amish have not only been able to thrive as a distinctive minority group in North American society, but in fact thrive, has to do with the fact that they are quite adaptable to external circumstances. Some things are non-negotiable as far as the practice of their faith, right? So for example, the structure of an Amish worship service is essentially unchanged over the last 300 plus years. And the basic core tenets of their faith, which I'll be sharing in a moment, also completely unchanged. But a lot of other things are up for negotiation in terms of like how they dress themselves, how they access technology, how they access things like medical care, how they interact with the larger society in which they live, right? Because as the rest of society changes, so do the Amish. The Amish have not only survived, they've thrived. There is no group of human beings on planet Earth that is growing faster than the Old Order Amish in the United States and Canada. Their population is doubling every 20 years. And how are you able to do that? Well, first, have a lot of kids and have a lot of those do something right whereby those kids will make the decision as young adults to formally join your church. So on average, there are something like 7 and 8 kids on average per Amish family, one mother. and about an 85 to 90% retention rate, which means that about 85 to 90% of children who are born into Amish families make the decision as young adults, so between the ages of 18 and 22 on average, to formally join the Old Order Amish Church. That's an extremely high retention rate. And it's not just having lots of babies, it's having lots of babies in societies where the healthcare system is such that most of those babies and moms will survive, right? There are plenty of other places around the world where, for example, family planning or artificial birth control are not practiced, but a lot of those kids die or they don't survive until the age of 3 or 4 or something, and in many cases, moms die, right? Maternal mortality is high. So the Amish are a success story. They must be doing something right. And what we're going to be talking about is exactly the secret sauce in many ways to the Amish success story that is here in the United States and Canada. But in order to really understand who the Amish people are, it's not about the buggy, it's not about limiting the use of technology, it's not about, are they using cell phones or landlines or smartphones or computers, that kind of thing. A lot of people get fixated on the superficials, right? On the way that they look and the way that they interact with things like technology and so forth. None of that will make sense. The so-called riddle of Amish culture does not make sense unless you understand that at the core of their society is a very, very strong Christian faith, right? So to be Amish is not to be, say, living simply for the sake of living simply, or doing organic farming, or avoiding use of computers. All those things kind of go with it, but it's all about how they live out their faith. And the core doctrines of the Christian faith that are held by the Amish are actually not dramatically different from many other Christians. It's just a question of how they translate that faith into everyday life. So let's do a little bit of sort of demographics here. The Amish are not the only sort of distinctive Christian community that has a kind of visibility in mainstream American society, in part because of dressing and grooming themselves distinctively, and also by limiting the access of technology. I mentioned that I myself, for example, am a Mennonite. Shorthand is that the Amish are historically a conservative splinter group off of the larger Mennonite body. And I'll talk about who Mennonites and Amish are in terms of doctrinal history in just a moment. But basically, the roots of the Mennonite church, or churches today, go back to Switzerland in the year 1525. So this was really at the time when the great reformers in Germanic Central Europe, so like Martin Luther, and then farther west, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland, but Martin Luther is the most famous one. At the time that there was a sort of very, very strong concern about spiritual health and renewal, and there was a group of reformers, we could say, who in many ways felt a kind of kinship spiritually to people like Martin Luther and his followers and Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland, but still felt that the Reform movement wasn't going far enough away, right, in terms of rejuvenating the Christian faith. So in 1525, there was a fairly dramatic breakaway in the city of Zurich, Switzerland, which is not the capital of Switzerland, but it's the largest city in Switzerland, in German-speaking Switzerland. There was a group of Christians who felt that they really needed to take a step back from many of these other churches, even the reforming churches around them. They became known as the Anabaptists, or in German, the Wiedertäufer, the rebaptizers, because the radical step that they took was literally on an evening of January 21st, 1525, in the city of Zurich, was to say, in order to be truly entering into a covenant with God with our eyes wide open, this needs to be a choice that we make as adults, that we understand what we're doing. And the most important rite of making that entry into a covenant with God is undergoing the sacrament of baptism. They said they had all been baptized before as infants, but they said that really doesn't count, right? We don't feel that infant baptism is a legitimate rite of passage because it's something that it represents a choice that somebody else makes for you, right? And so because they said, now we're going to do it right. And because they were baptizing themselves technically for the second time in the view of outsiders, but for themselves, for the first time, they were called rebaptizers, which was a term that was very, very negative, right? It was basically heretical at the time. But the term has stuck to this day. So Amish, Mennonites, and smaller churches, all of our churches are known as the so-called Anabaptist family of churches. And the thing that all of our churches share in common is still this practice of what's called believer's baptism, or not exactly adult baptism, it depends, but it's essentially in most churches, traditional churches, between the ages of 16 and 22, 23 years old. Among the Amish, sort of the youngest is about 18 up until the early 20s. So there are Old Order Mennonites, so the most conservative form of Mennonites. They are located not in this part of the state so much, really down here toward Grant County in the southwest, and then up especially like in Clark County, Clark and Taylor counties in the central part. But they're sort of distantly related to the Amish and share a lot in common in terms of lifestyle and certainly faith, but they're a distinct group. They do operate horse and buggy for transportation, but have electricity, for example, in their homes. But as you can tell by there's only 2 quilts that are in the state that are Old Order Mennonite. The vast majority of Anabaptists in the state are Old Order Amish. Wisconsin has the 4th largest Amish population. How many states of the 50 states would you guess has an Amish population in it? Just how many would you guess? Sorry? 15? 40? Sorry? Did somebody say 50? 50? No, it's actually 31. So it's 31 US states and then 4 Canadian provinces. But again, the number is double, their population is doubling every 20 years. And so it's quite likely that they will be expanding into other states as well. But into the early 20th century, it was really just a handful of states. It was basically 6 or 7 states. So just to kind of tie some of the things together that I've already shared, the Amish are a Christian group. And if you would ask them sort of like, how do you identify yourself? As first and foremost, they say, we're Christians, right? We're Christians. It's part of the so-called Anabaptist family of churches. Anabaptist, again, meaning essentially shorthand for practicing adult or believer's baptism. And it started as what was called the Radical Reformation. Today, it's not considered particularly radical, but in the late 1400s and the early 1500s. Theologically, or in terms of doctrine, Amish and Mennonites are extremely similar to one another. So where do the names come from? The name Mennonite is taken from an early Anabaptist leader whose name was Menno Simons. And so his followers were known as Mennonists originally, and then eventually Mennonites. So 1525 is when the Mennonite movement begins. About 170 years later, 1693, the movement had spread from Switzerland up the Rhine into France and Germany all the way up to the Netherlands. Down in Switzerland still, there was a group of Mennonites who just simply called themselves the Brethren, or the Swiss Brethren. And some converts to the Anabaptist faith felt that these Anabaptists had drifted a little bit. They were a little bit too close to the social mainstream. And one particularly zealous convert was a guy named Jacob Amann. And we don't know a whole lot about him, but we do know that he was a convert. And we do know something about zealousness, right, of the sort of so-called zeal of converts. People kind of bring a sort of greater fire in a belly when they make a very, very conscious decision to join a different group, or a church in this case. He was also a rather feisty person and had some fallings out with some of the older leaders in the Swiss Brethren movement. And so that led to a split in 1693, and his followers became known as the Amish. But the name Amann is no longer, probably was never even brought to North America by the earliest Amish that came over here. Amish know very, very little about who Jacob Amann is, and historians not much more. Menno Simons, however, is still a fairly familiar figure, and there's not there's no bad blood or anything like that between Amish and Mennonites. In fact, they feel that there's a strong kinship going in both directions. So things have definitely been smoothed over. But in general, the followers of Jacob Amann were somewhat more conservative and felt that it was important to have a greater distance between themselves and their non-Anabaptist neighbors. So that was where the name Amish comes from. The first Amish came to North America within about 20 years of that year, 1693. So it was about 1710, 1712 that the first Amish started emigrating. In the entire colonial era, so from about 1710 to 1760, there were only about 350 Amish that came over. And if you think 350,000 today, there would be a lot more. But over the years, there were some that left the Amish movement. And there was a big sort of division or schism that happened in the late 1800s, where about 2/3 of the Amish actually left the Amish church and became what are Mennonites today. But there was this sort of older core, conservative core, that stayed with that and has demographically, because they simply have more kids and have greater retention rate, have expanded quite significantly. And they are known since that time, so since the 1870s, as the Old Order Amish, right, the most conservative Amish. So there is a real spectrum among Amish. So there's not one kind of Amish. And even folks that have just sort of like casual neighbors or something like that, you recognize that there are differences. And there are probably, there's an estimate of minimum about 40 different Amish subgroups. And much of that sort of spectrum of diversity is represented right here in Wisconsin. In general, most Amish in Wisconsin tend to be on the more conservative side, which means that their use of technology, it's really mainly use of technology is the kind of dividing line, their use of technology is somewhat more limited than more progressive groups. The largest settlement of Amish in the state is not far from here. It's in it's the so-called Cashton community. Vernon County as a county has the largest Amish population of any county in Wisconsin. And there are a couple of different groups here in Vernon County that are friends but are not in full fellowship with one another. But they all tend to be fairly conservative relative to, say, Amish in places like northern Indiana, eastern Ohio, and southeastern Pennsylvania. And again, sort of summarizing here, population is 350,000 today. Wisconsin is the fourth largest population. It's about 22,000. There are about 5,000 older Mennonites in the state. So I don't expect you to be able to see this, but I just want to kind of describe, and you can find this on the internet. This is a chart of just some of the major Amish subgroups distinguished from one another in terms of their adaptation to technology. So basically, the vast majority of Amish do not use tractors for field work, right? That's one thing that they share in common. So basically, all Amish use horse and buggy transportation as something that they own and operate themselves. Some will have tractors for things like the PTO shaft, right? Or running other kinds of machinery. But as far as for field work, for field cultivation, almost no Amish will use the tractor for that, right? And so that's all the no here, except for two progressive groups, one in Western Pennsylvania, Somerset County, PA, and then Kelowna, Iowa, which is just south of Iowa City. And then on the yes side, virtually almost all, have motorized washing machines. This is one thing where Amish women long ago put their foot down and said, we're going to have all these kids, that's a lot of laundry. And the difference between having a motorized washing machine and another way to clean your clothes, it's basically, we're talking about washboards, and that just does not cut it. Even if you're just changing your clothes like once or twice a week, that's a lot of laundry. And so they're not fancy LG front loader wringer, washers. They're wringer washers, right? But they're nonetheless motorized, and they're typically run by Honda motors. And then there are all kinds of other things in between. But basically, the Amish subgroups are not distinguished in any way by their religious faith. It's just simply in terms of their adaptation to technology. And this diversity is actually one of the keys to the Amish success, because if, for example, you grew up or were born into a community that has certain kinds of technological acceptances or rejections that you, when you come of age, feel a little bit uncomfortable with, that you would want to go a little bit more progressive, well, then you can move somewhere else. Or if you'd want to maybe hold back a little bit more, you think things are going a little bit fast, well, then you move away. Many of the Amish that live in Wisconsin came from communities that were a little bit so-called higher or more progressive in places like, for example, northern Indiana. And they say, this is getting to be a little bit of a rat race here. We'd like to hold back somewhat. And so, for example, the Hillsborough community, which is almost all derived from northern Indiana, they very expressly felt uncomfortable with a lot of the sort of progressive tendencies, especially among young people, that they found in northern Indiana. And so they felt it was important to pull back. And so that's how they ended up coming to Wisconsin. This is just an image of Menno Simons. We know a lot about Menno Simons. He was a very prolific writer, very, very popular writing still among the Amish today. Part of the reason that he's so familiar is that he was the only early Anabaptist leader that lived long enough to die a natural death. All of the other Anabaptists leaders were murdered, right? And part of the reason, there are no Amish left in Europe. There's a small Mennonite presence, but part of the reason that the Amish are in the United States is that they really had to leave, that they left so quickly, for example, between 1693 and about 1710, that it was just not a hospitable place. And even to this day, for as a lot of the positive things we think about countries like Switzerland, there's very, very serious kinds of discrimination there. And we can talk about that more in the discussion. But one thing that's still a very, very difficult issue for Mennonites that still live in Switzerland is that it has mandatory military service for men. And you have to, if you're able-bodied, you have to do some kind of military practice until the age of 40. And you have to have a firearm in your home, a government-owned handgun in your home in the unlikely event that Switzerland would be attacked, right? You have to swear allegiance to the state. And these are things that are profoundly against the Anabaptist doctrine of nonviolence. So these are just some, kind of concentric circles. The vast majority of Anabaptists are not so-called plain people. In other words, dressing distinctively, right? Simply. The term plain comes originally from a Quaker word describing how Quakers used to dress as well. Mennonites are more numerous worldwide, and vast majority, as I say, do not dress distinctively. Some are plain, but among plain Anabaptists, the Amish definitely are in the majority. So there are not many plain Mennonites. There are a few smaller plain groups, including a group here in Wisconsin, actually not that far from where we are this evening, called German Baptists or Old German Baptists. They dress distinctively, but they own and operate motor vehicles. And despite their name, they actually use English. They don't speak German anymore. They're also a plain Anabaptist group, but they do operate motor vehicles. So these are the five major beliefs among all Anabaptists, including Amish. We talked about believers' baptism, separation of church and state, which is, not controversial in the United States, but 400, 500 years ago, then was fighting words, right? Where state and church were working very, very closely with one another. And the Amish and other Anabaptists felt that it's one thing to be respectful of the country that you live in and to pay your taxes, right? To be good citizens and to obey laws. But it's another thing for the government to tell you how you should practice your faith. They said it really needs to be kept separate. And when this separation or freedom of conscience and religion and separation of church and state was enshrined in the US Constitution, that was a very, very dramatic step, right, in the world at the time, right? It's now considered, we don't question that here, but it was very, very radical notion. And that was part of the reason that Anabaptists were so drawn to come to North America, right? Because of the proverbial freedom of religion. The Amish faith is something that you don't just think about on Sunday mornings. It's something that they think about really 24/7. So it doesn't inform, like, say, for example, we're at McDonald's and I'm going to choose this or that meal or something like that. Your faith doesn't get down to that level, but it does inform the ways that you say, how do you raise your kids, right? How do you interact with your neighbors, both Amish and non-Amish? How do you deal with conflict, right? How do you deal with disagreements, right? How do you access health care, right? These are things that also have an impact, a connection with their faith. The term that they would use in German, Nachfolge, discipleship, means literally following after, right? Which means following the model of Jesus. So they say they're not really deep into a lot of theological concepts, but they'll say, we do have a model for everyday living in terms of principles and actual actions. And they would say, and that's Jesus. So even though they recognize that the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is considered the inspired word of God, they place a special emphasis on the stories of Jesus in the Gospels. And they would also say that in terms of virtues, that they strive to live humble lives, right? To be a humble people. The German word that they use is Demut, and to avoid expressions of pride. So things like narcissism and materialism and selfishness. They tend to think not so much in I, me, it's more sort of we, us, right? Thinking about the larger community. One thing that distinguished Anabaptists, but especially the followers of Jacob Amann, was the idea that the rest of society is probably not going to be living lives of virtue in line with Christian values. And so we need to kind of keep a step back. The Amish would say they're not striving to be completely independent of larger society, but maybe a little bit autonomous is the way they put it, right? And so they'll say things like, for example, Christmas, right? Christmas is something that's widely celebrated by a lot of people other than Anabaptists or even Christians in North American society. And they say, we think that Christmas is important to honor but we just don't want to make as big a deal out of it as like saying, oh, like Best Buy is going to have the Christmas sale or Black Friday, this and that, or where they see things that are, they see certain aspects of less than virtuous behavior being played out in the larger society. And this is where their decision to stay apart from national politics also figures in. They see a lot of things in political behavior and rhetoric as being really antithetical to their interpretation of the Christian faith, including things like, I am going to fight for you if I'm elected, right? And this is not just like one party thing. Every candidate says, I'm going to go and fight for you. This and that, but they say, please, no. Maybe you can negotiate, or you can have a conversation, or you can build friendships or something. And unfortunately, that rhetoric just does not work for a lot of politicians today. I mean, going back for a long time, but especially today. And so there's the satisfaction. It's like, we just need to be a little bit out of sync with what's going on in a larger society, which a lot of other Americans can sort of identify with, I think, right? And that's often marked symbolically through as I say, we dress distinctively to signify the fact that we are, thinking in different ways. We have slightly different values. Limiting technology is part of that too. And then also the last point I'm going to be sharing with you this evening is the fact that they actually speak a language that is pretty much just their own, right? It's a language that used to be spoken by other descendants of German settlers to colonial Pennsylvania. It's called Pennsylvania Dutch. It's a language that I speak. And this is actually how I got into, I'm looking at Sherry here, and working in the healthcare and interacting I started as a medical interpreter, and now I'm a patient navigator for folks in the healthcare system, and doing a lot of running interference for plain people in the healthcare sector. And a lot of that goes back to language use and like how you talk about your body and your health and the maintenance of your health and recovery of health. All adults are bilingual, but there's something about your mother tongue, right? That first language, the language that you use within your group that makes it somewhat special. And so that's also a marker, the fact that they are bilingual, completely bilingual, in a language that really nobody else speaks other than them and a few of us. That is also a symbol of nonconformity. And then non-resistance, right? Which, as I say, is like not just simply being a pacifist and saying, I'm not going to serve in the military, but I'm not going to engage in any kind of violent behavior. And not just like physical violence, but also emotional violence, right? Or verbal violence. Now, sadly, the Amish have enjoyed an incredible amount of security and happiness in North America. Right? And they say that, we're incredibly grateful for all the, negatives and stuff that they see around them in American society. They know enough about their history to be very, very grateful about where they are, right? Now, they're not flag-waving patriots, right? But they're very grateful, right? And feel good about the fact that where they're living in places like the United States and Canada. They also tell a lot of stories about the days of persecution, and probably one of the most famous stories took place. This was an Anabaptist man in the Netherlands, as you can sort of tell maybe by the windmill that's there. This is a true story. It's a man named Dirk Willems, he was a Mennonite, so it was before the Amish division off of the Mennonites. He was one of these early Mennonite leaders who, like most of them, had been arrested, tortured, and forced to recant, or expected to recant. If they didn't, then they were executed. And this was, Dirk Willems was an early Anabaptist leader. He was imprisoned and for several months, and under circumstances that are not entirely clear, he escaped his prison. And that was not considered a violation of non-resistance. If you could escape, go, right? And so he escaped from, we know where it was, the building is no longer there, but in the months that he had been incarcerated, he lost a fair amount of weight, and was running over a kind of frozen marshy area, and was then being pursued by guards. And so he, as a fairly light person at that point, was able to walk over the ice fairly well. But all of a sudden he hears one of his guards has fallen through the ice and is like drowning and calling for help. And what did Dirk Willems do? He stopped, he ran back, and he pulled that man out of the ice and saved his life. And then what happened? The rest of the guards came around him, rearrested Dirk Willems, and he was dead a couple of weeks later, executed. And the moral of that story that's told to all Amish kids is not that Dirk Willems should have kept running, but that Dirk Willems did what he was called to do as a Christian. And sometimes it's not going to make for an easy life now, but hopefully this will lead to better times afterward, right? And so this is a story of like putting one's faith to the test. Thankfully, there have been very, very few incidences of that in the United States in terms of almost no government persecution. But sadly, the cruelest event in all of Amish history that ever happened was not something that was government inspired, but it was coming from a neighbor of the Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, almost exactly 15 years ago. So it was in October of 2006. This is the so-called Nickel Mines school shooting. And sadly, we all know that school shootings, it's almost like every couple of weeks we're reading about some sort of incidents of gun violence. This was the so-called West Nickel Mines, the school in the community of West Nickel Mines. The schoolhouse was torn down after this event, but you probably heard this story, right? So it was a mentally disturbed man who was not Amish, but lived amid Amish and Mennonite neighbors in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Very, very serious mental illness problems that had challenges for many years. But his wife, extended family, had no clue what he was going to do, which was to arm himself to the teeth, prepare to do a lot of horrible things, barricaded himself in that school, and sent out the boys, sent out the teacher, sent out a pregnant mom. One little first grade girl escaped with the boys. There were 10 girls left. He lined them up in the front, by the blackboard in the front of the room, and shot each one of them execution style. And 5 were killed, and 5 were wounded, one very, very severely wounded. And this was all done, and then he shot himself. This was done within 40 minutes by the time that the SWAT team from Lancaster County had come by. And this was all by, like 11 o'clock in the morning that this was all over. And by the later afternoon, a small committee of Amish people went over to the shooter's family's home. And the shooter's father was inconsolable. This man who had very, very close ties to Amish people was bawling. And Amish are not particularly touchy-feely and huggy and that sort of thing, but an elderly Amish man came up and gave him a big bear hug and says, "Don't worry, we love you. And we want to do whatever we can to support you because you're suffering too. And we would like to pay our respects to your family by attending Charlie's funeral," the shooter's funeral, and they did. And there were millions of dollars of donations coming from around the world that came in, right? This was world news, right? Millions of dollars that came in donations for the survivors' families. And there was a steering committee of Amish men put together to manage the funds immediately. And the committee decided right away that a portion of those funds would be set aside for the shooter's family because they say he's left behind a widow and 3 kids that don't have a dad anymore, and the extended family. They're going to be suffering as well. And there are a number, there's been a play that's been written about this. There's a number of books and TV documentaries and stuff. I highly recommend this book that talks about it, Amish Grace, How Forgiveness Transcended Tragedy. And forgiveness is a core aspect of how they live out their faith. It's not to excuse, it's not to condone, it's not to forget bad things. It's to forego your right to revenge, right? It's to say, I am not going to escalate this by being angry about it and fighting back or getting revenge. I'm going to try to move on. And it's not easy. I know one family that had 3 kids in the schoolhouse. One killed, one escaped, and the other was severely wounded. And the family says, it's a journey, right? We've made the decision to forgive, but it's not something that all of a sudden we can just say, I don't have any bitterness or any anger, right, that I'm struggling with. And it wasn't that many years later that the Sandy Hook incident, which is one of the worst, probably, I think it's the worst school shooting, right? Not college or university, but school shooting that happened, right? The Sandy Hook thing in Connecticut. And the Amish, without any kind of, interest in publicity or anything like that, started writing letters to the families who had lost kids or had survivors there. They say, we know what you're going through. And then a year later, they actually went and visited. And they say, this is something that we can share, right, with the larger community. We can witness, right, to what we have experienced and the journey that we are on now. And this is a way of kind of giving back, right, to the larger community. Something, again, not widely publicized. This is from actually just a local newspaper in Newtown, Connecticut, where this happened. So it was not one of those things that sort of got a lot of national press. But again, this is sort of like putting one's faith into practice 24/7 and taking something that's absolutely horrific and no justification whatsoever and trying to find some sort of silver lining in it. So what is the economic profile of Amish in places like Wisconsin? Well, it's quite mixed, right? So a lot of people assume that all Amish farm. No, actually, most Amish do not farm as their main source of income. They live in rural areas and they have gigantic gardens, which could be considered as almost like farm scale agriculture by outsiders. But it's only about 15% of Amish nationwide depend on agriculture as their main source of income. Why? Because it's hard to make a lot of money or enough money to be able to support large families just on farming alone. So they've practiced a kind of diverse sort of economic profile of things like other kinds of industries, and especially popular in Wisconsin is anything that has to do with wood. So furniture, cabinetry, I noticed that there are a number of rockers out there. I'm assuming those are Amish-made rockers. A lot of Amish make cabinets and do kitchen remodeling and home remodeling and roofing and home building and these kinds of things. And then things like, for example, bulk food stores, right? So other kinds of enterprises. Basically the number of sort of non-farming Amish has increased in the same way that a lot of family farms in sort of general American society have sort of gone down. And this diversification has actually led to a lot of empowerment for women entrepreneurs. So historically, Amish women were kind of like the farm managers, the bookkeepers and stuff, and so it was sort of a natural extension that they would become essentially the business entrepreneurs, the proprietors. So there's a lot of these businesses are in fact female run. Community is extremely, I mentioned before, it's extremely important. Amish don't think in terms of I, me, it's more sort of we, us. You can't be a hermit and be Amish, right? And that leads to what they'll say is a lot of kind of little s social security, the feeling like as you get older that somebody has your back, right? You do not have to worry about, say, your kids not having enough time to see you, right? Because your kids value the fact that you are still with them. And just kind of practically, most Amish people get married when they're in their early 20s. And if things go well, then they're grandparents in their early 40s and great-grandparents when they're in their 60s. And that's about the time that a lot of Amish decide to retire. So as great-grandparents, starting in their early 60s, and there's a kind of natural sort of symbiosis here because you got a lot of kids, there's a lot of need for child care and that sort of thing. And so you've got grandparents and great-grandparents or uncles and aunts or neighbors and friends and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of contact across the generations in Amish society that is not at all unusual for the rest of the world historically, and including American society up until about the 20th century, but it's rather unusual today. Right? This is something how the Amish have kind of preserved a sort of healthy, it takes a village attitude towards community development and especially raising children that has kind of been lost in the social mainstream. Food is an important part of that. People say, how is it they stay relatively trim and they're eating all this sugar and this and that or whatever? Well, they're taking not 10,000 steps a day, but between 17 and 19,000 steps a day. And overall, their immune health is quite good. Their infant mortality is somewhat lower than the national average, and their life expectancy is quite high. It's at really the top. And the rest of American society kind of came up to the Amish. The rest of society has gone down a little bit over the last couple of years. The Amish are up there in that sort of, hugging around 80, sort of like 80 to 82 life expectancy. And a lot of that, they'll say, has to do with simply, as they get older, they just don't have to worry. They don't have to worry about pensions. They don't have to worry about being lonely. They don't have to worry about being sent off somewhere where they don't want to live, right? And even if they have, for example, elders have very, very serious kinds of medical needs that may, for example, require, say, like a breathing machine, right, that needs electricity, something more than a generator can then handle, they'll get an electric wire to come into the home just for that purpose, right, so that you can keep grandma or grandpa in the home with you. Dressing and grooming, again, it's that sort of, way of kind of identifying themselves as sort of the team that they're on. And I know, for example, I was hoping that somebody would have green or gold or red and white this evening to indicate that we always mark our identities and our loyalties and our affinities in the way that we dress, but especially when it comes to sports teams, right? And so you can think about it's like go pack, go Amish pack, right? That's the way that they sort of look at it. And it's a way of sort of, they feel good. And then the way that uniforms also kind of convey that sort of the community feeling. So let's talk a little bit more about technology and then kind of wrap things up. So, this is part of this puzzle. It's like, why do they accept certain things and not others? Well, the bottom line is they say, we will accept certain aspects of technology as long as it contributes to our economic health and stability and promotes good community life, but nothing really beyond that, right? So not just get something for the sake of it being nice and new, and they don't want things that promote too much individualism. So take, for example, these two or three appliances. So we've got a dryer and a washer and a dishwasher. Every Amish home has a dishwasher. We saw that, right? Motorized washing machine. It's not nearly as slick as that, right? But they still have motorized washing machines. No Amish home has a dryer and no Amish home has a dishwasher. And people say, where's the logic there? Why can you have something like this, but not that and not that? They say, well, it's actually quite clear. First of all, the alternative between having a washing machine and not a washing machine, as I said before, is the washboard. And mom says, no, not going there, right? But is a dryer absolutely necessary? Not really. Even in winter, right? May get a little bit chilly, but at least the air is dry. And who doesn't like the smell of line-dried laundry, right? So they say it's eco-friendly, it's cheaper, right? And you can actually get more done if you've got a really big line. So it's not going to bias anything at all, right? It's not like nearly as labor intensive because you're just clipping them on the line and then spinning the line out. That's fine. And what about the dishwasher? They say, one of the nice things about washing dishes is that it's not an individual's sole task. It's something that you can get the littlest kids involved in and say, okay, you clear the table and you bring these plates over to the sink and that you scrape off. There's not going to be much to scrape because they've cleaned it off quite well. And then you can wash, you can rinse, you can dry, you can put away. And what a great team effort. And what are you doing? You're not just standing there on an assembly line. You're joking, you're splashing water, you're singing songs, you're telling stories. What a great way to have community life. And so they say, do we have an opportunity to do some work? Is it together with a group of people? I'm all for it. Some things like barn raisings and quilting bees and all these kinds of things. So they see this as completely unnecessary and in fact, not good for community life, right? So this is a wringer washer here. This is line drying, and this is just a slight slice of what one would see after a meal. So what about the telephone? Right? When telephones came out almost exactly 100 years ago, a little bit more than 100 years ago in North America, a lot of people said, including Amish, that say, this is great. This is, we can communicate with people over large distances, and especially for business purposes. This is something that's really, really practical. And then all of a sudden, when people started putting their phones in their homes, they said, uh-oh, it's a little bit like when, for example, somebody's cell phone goes off in their pocket or their purse or their jacket or something like that. And then it's like, okay, maybe it's something that I wish I had kind of left in the car, right? Or maybe I'm spending a little bit too much time right in front of my screen. And this is something I think about all the time at the university. I just like stand on a corner on the campus and I just see, this kind of thing, right? We all know that things there's too much of a good thing sometimes. And so they say, this is also true with telephones. They say, let's have our cake and eat it too. Let's not have it in the center of our home where it disturbs us. Let's just have it out in the barn or a shed or a phone shanty where it's there when we need it and for emergency purposes, that kind of thing. But it's not going to be in my pocket. It's not going to be in my living room or my dining room, disturbing family life. Amish are not hermits. They're not holier than thou. They also don't think that they don't want anything to do with the rest of society. Scott has already talked about that. They thrive when they know their neighbors, who are going to include non-Amish people as well, in part because there's a sort of mutual support that goes on there. Sometimes it's like, hey, can you drive me to the supercenter, right? Or to the Aldi's or to the Dollar General store or something like that. And you like cookies? Here, that kind of thing. This is basically their kind of view of community life is really American community life in rural America. in the 18th and the 19th centuries, right? Where everybody knew everybody and everybody had each other's backs, right? They thrive on that sort of face-to-face, first-name basis interaction with people. And in Pennsylvania, this is a scene from Pennsylvania, the Amish and Mennonites have for many years been big supporters of a program that's known as the Fresh Air Fund, which was started in New York City in the 1850s by wealthy people. It basically said, these poor kids that are in these horrible tenements and not getting much fresh air or anything like that. And this was before people took vacations or sent kids to camps or something like that. They say, these rich people said, let's send these poor inner city kids out onto farms for the summer. That was the Fresh Air Fund. And the Amish and the Mennonites were like really on board with that. And to this day, if you go to rural Lancaster County in the summertime, you'll see small African-American, Hispanic kids largely coming from places like inner city Philadelphia, Baltimore, in some cases New York City, who are dressed Amish, right? And those are fresh air kids, right? P. Diddy, right, the rapper, was a fresh air kid in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, right? He was one of the more famous ones. This is a little girl that's just coming from Philly. So the Amish, as I mentioned before, have kind of diversified, right? So this is a lumber, sort of a Menards on steroids, if Menards weren't already on steroids. In Ohio, it's called Schrock Lumber, and it's basically all Amish running it, computers, all that sort of stuff. At work, come home, no computers. But they're very, very savvy. The only time that I've ever seen 3D printers at work was in an Amish factory, run on generators, right? And they were making a very specific kind of part for lanterns, for high-pressure gas lanterns, right? 3D printers, Amish technology. So I'm going to leave you tonight with one last image that's kind of an oral image, which is the Pennsylvania Dutch language, right? Just so you get a sense of what it looks like and what it sounds like. This is although they're all bilingual, their parochial schools are conducted completely in English. So kids by the end of the first grade are already speaking English like their non-Amish counterparts. But there's something about that first language that's called the Muttersprach, the mother tongue, right? That has a kind of special power in some ways, a special significance. And that's this language called Pennsylvania Dutch. Despite its name, it's descended from German dialects that were brought to Pennsylvania in the colonial era. And this is the last image I'm going to leave you with. This is, the language is typically not written down much. They tend to use English for writing, reading and writing, and then German for religious purposes. So like, for example, the Luther translation of the Bible, their prayer books and hymnals are in German. But on occasion, they do write in Pennsylvania Dutch. And this is an example of a small book of Bible stories that were written by Amish people. The title is Welle Lese, Let's Read, and the subtitle is Bibelstories for Kinderen. And story sounds a little bit like English story. Yeah, right? So this is a language that has been spoken by people that have also been speaking English for the last nearly 300 years. And so about 15% of the vocabulary of Pennsylvania Dutch is English, right? Which is not a huge amount, actually. So I'm going to read you the creation story in Pennsylvania Dutch, as an Amish parent would say that to their kid at about this time, about putting them to bed. The plot is going to be familiar, so I don't need to translate it. So it's the beginning of the creation story. It's not a Bible translation, but it's a paraphrase, right? Bible story. Der Staat van die Erd. Wie lang terug het geen Erd gehad, geen licht, geen helling. Es war alles juist dunkel geweest. Verster damit hat Gott der Himmel und die Erd gemacht. Nur gesagt, lass es Licht sein. Just wie sel was Licht geweest. Gott hat's Licht Tag gegessen, uns dunkel Nacht. Das war nur der erste Tag, als Leben war. Der nächste Tag hat die Wolke gemacht. Hat auch die Luft gemacht, so dass man schlafen kann. Auf der dritten Tag hat das Wasser ins Land verteilt. Hat die See und die Himmel gemacht, alle Tag. Hat noch gesagt, lass die Bäume ins Gras wachsen. Und sie haben noch wachsen. All right, with that, I thank you for your attention. And as long as people care to, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes, ma'am.
We moved here 15 years ago from the Chicago area. And the gentleman that we bought our house from, this is in Hillsborough, I know there were some Amish. I don't think the entire house was built by Amish, but there were some. And we moved ourselves, and in dealing with the gentleman that owned the house, he was moving not too far away, and he had an Amish friend who was moving him. So we asked him, would they be interested in earning a little money? And since we were driving our own truck up, and he said, sure. So he and his son came and unloaded our truck and put everything where we asked him to put it. And then we drove him home because our friend, the man we bought the house from, was gone. And on the way, I asked a lot of questions, and we got to his house, and he said, would you like to come in and see the house? Well, I was thrilled, like, of course.
Sure.
And I just went into the living room area, and he told me about some of the things. Well, after that, when family and friends would come up to visit us, I would take him down the road that Fred lived on. And if he was out there, he would always say, you know, come on in. Very, very nice man. Probably the last people that came up and he was outside were my brother, my sister, and my mom. And mom was about 90 at the time, and she wasn't moving real well. And my brother and my sister got out and talked to Fred. Fred came over to the car and shook my mother's hand and talked to her for a little while. And my mother, she lived another couple of years after that. She never stopped talking about how nice that man was to her, because I think with other relatives that had gotten to that age, you kind of ignore them when there's a gathering, you know, it's like they don't, well, he made her feel so special.
That's nice.
We were upset because then Fred moved to Missouri, I believe. And we were told that, I don't really know the right words, he was requested to move down there, or ordered. I don't think it was ordered, but I've always wondered, do Amish, he was kind of a pillar of the community, we found out, of the Amish community. Do Amish, are they requested by a bishop or something
No.
to move?
No.
To different places because they need a person like that?
No. There's no real top-down hierarchy at all in Amish society. There are bishops. There's so-called 3 members of the ministry: bishop, minister, and deacon. And yes, the bishop is kind of like the spokesperson, is the person who is able to officiate at weddings and funerals and baptisms and that sort of thing. They're basically, it's a very democratic structure. So bishops only sort of like kind of hold the line and sort of enforce things in some ways, that sort of community rules, but those are rules that are sort of democratically determined. Now, that being said, there are some bishops that are a little bit more, this is very human, that are a little bit more proactive in terms of like more leaderly, or having more leadership qualities, and others that are more sort of little bit kind of hang back a little bit. So, but no bishop would say, you need to move here or anything like that. They would not have any kind of authority to do that. If they were, they would be considered very un-Amish, because that's something, it's considered extremely, it's against the principle of humility. Let's put it that way. It would be considered very unhumble behavior. So, you know, people move in and out of communities for different reasons, and the stories that kind of make their way out, it's a little bit the game of telephone sometimes, but I can definitely say that there is nothing that one would be ordered to move for any reason from one community to the next. It's just, it's not possible. Not possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask one more question? If I decided the first of the year, I don't like the life I'm living, I want to become Amish, I really like it. How could that happen? I don't know any Amish. Could that happen?
A couple in Hillsborough that have done that, as a matter of fact. Out of the 350,000 Amish today in North America, the estimate is somewhere around 200 that were born to non-Amish parents. It's extremely rare. And first of all, it has to be for spiritual reasons. You can't do it because you say, I like living simply, I want to dress this way, I like horses, or anything like that. It has to be because of the religious faith.
Or would the bishop be the one that would say you can do this? Or
no, it wouldn't be a bishop. It would be, sort of a community-wide thing. But you know, there are some they're called seekers, people that decide that they want to join, and the recommendation is, they say, people tell us like, why don't you just find a church that is easier as far as technology? Because it's really hard for people to give up a lot of stuff. We can gain things, it's easy to leave, but to sort of give up technology, they don't want people to join, and then after a couple of years, the romance wears off, and then they leave again, which has happened. I've known people that have done that. So there's really kind of a process of discernment. I'll give you an example of Hillsborough. There is a couple that actually still lives in this area, who were in they never had kids, they were in their upper 50s, maybe early 60s, Catholic, both of them Catholic background, very strong Catholic faith, who felt that they wanted to become Amish. And so they lived in this area and lived in close proximity, and for a couple of years, and dressed Amish, lived, had a little cottage on an Amish farm and that kind of thing, started to try and learn Pennsylvania Dutch. I kind of helped them with that. And then they actually started going through, after a couple of years, it's sort of like a catechism type process or whatever, sort of learning the faith in the lead up to baptism. And then they decided, it's not for us. And the community was, not going to say you can't do that, because they were not going to pass judgment on them. But in retrospect, the community that they were living in was like saying, it didn't look like it was going to work out, so they made the right decision to kind of pull out before it went too far, right? And the thing is, they don't want to see somebody get baptized and then go back on that baptismal vow, because that baptism is a big deal, right? And of that 10 to 15% of young people that are born to Amish parents that make the decision not to join the church, it's truly that they don't join the church. There's very few that join after they're baptized and then leave later. That's a very, very small minority. And that leads to some sort of hard feelings. But, they recognize that there's a sort of romanticism that a lot of outsiders have. And they say, look, it's not about the hat, it's not about the buggy, it's not about the cute kids, it's not about the farm or whatever, it's about the Christian faith, right? And it's things, then you've got to really sort of be on our wavelength as far as the faith goes. And if you're not there, this is not going to work for you, right? Then go buy an organic farm, live naturally, simply. We'll be your neighbor, we'll share recipes with you, but it's not going to be a member of the church.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, sir.
Is the Amish faith by grace through Jesus Christ alone, or is the faith based upon works? Usually works come after salvation, right? Grace.
So,
is there a distinction with them that they get saved through Christ first?
they would say yes, but I think what you're referring to is the doctrine of assurance of salvation, where somebody says, I believe, and therefore I am saved. The Amish will say, I believe, and I hope I'm saved. And that's something that is, so it's called the doctrine of assurance of salvation, which is the norm in many evangelical churches and many other Protestant churches. And the Amish will say, I hope that what I'm doing is right and that my faith is strong, but I am not going to be so presumptuous as to make that judgment even for myself. Let me give you an example. I was at a funeral some years ago up in Bonduel, Wisconsin, which is Shawano County. There's not many Amish in that part of the state, but there's an Amish community there. And this was an elderly woman who'd been in her 80s, had 13 kids, 12 of whom were Amish, and the 13th was doing just fine in a Mennonite church, raft of grandkids and great-grandkids. Sweet grandma. Everybody loved this woman. And, just really was on the scale of sweetness, just way up there, right? And I remember it was at a certain point in the funeral, there's an open casket, right? And there she was lying in there, and the bishop who was preaching the main sermon was standing there and looking down, and he says in German, Pennsylvania Dutch, he says, we have a lot of hope for this woman, right? So it's, in many non-Amish communities, they would say, Grandma's looking down at us right now because Grandma's in heaven. We're certain that Grandma's in heaven. And the Amish will say, we have a lot of confidence and hope, but we're not going to be so presumptuous as to say we know definitely that somebody is in heaven now or that somebody is destined for heaven. And that is a major difference between Amish and Anabaptist, many Anabaptists, not all Anabaptists, there's some Anabaptists that actually do have assurance of salvation, but this is one major wedge between the Amish and evangelical Protestants. So I'll leave it at that.
Can I just say one verse in that? 1 John 5:13 says, God speaking these things are written to you, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, that you may know that you
I know.
have eternal life. I've tried to get to a point with a few Amish of explaining that verse to them, but they usually don't want to discuss that. Is there any way of reaching them?
No. No. Yes.
Does that mean they believe in a hell? Is it
They do believe in hell.
Okay.
Yes.
Are you in one place or the other in their belief system?
Yeah, I mean, for example, there's no such thing as purgatory, right? That's not, they would not, there's no biblical basis they would say for that, but they would say, you know, they try not to think too much about or speculate about like the details or whatever, because if you really look closely in the Bible, and it's a very, very Bible-based kind of faith, if it's not somewhere explicit in the Bible, they kind of put it off to the side. That's, you know, for example, Christmas. Christmas is not in the Bible, right? We don't know the 25th of December and this and that or whatever. Generally, you know, whatever, that kind of thing. And so there's not a lot of explicit descriptions about things that say like, you know, hellfire and brimstone and stuff, that, or even descriptions of what heaven is necessarily going to be like. And so they try and avoid a lot of specifically detailed things that they would see as distracting from what they have actual control over now, which is their discipleship, right? They have control over how they're able to act in the here and now. And they try to do their best as followers of Jesus in terms of Jesus' actions and Jesus' teachings. And that's what they try and focus on. And then just have a lot of hope, right? It's not, you know, only works that's going to save them. They believe in grace first and works going with that, but they see the two as going hand in hand with one another. But they don't, and they believe in, definitely believe in heaven, and they definitely believe in hell, but they don't spend a lot of time kind of thinking about particulars about it. Gil?
I don't know, did you mention the Church of the Brethren?
I did not, but the Church of the Brethren is also an Anabaptist. Yes, yes. Church of the Brethren were originally known as the Dunkards, right, for the fact that they practice full immersion baptism, so dunking, right? The Old German Baptists that I mentioned before, their full name is Old German Baptist Brethren, because they're part of that, the full immersion, those Baptists in that sense, yes.
They share the same similar spiritual foundational system?
Very similar, extremely similar. Some have their roots actually in Lutheranism, in the so-called Pietist branch of Lutheranism. So they didn't necessarily descend directly from Anabaptists, but in many cases kind of converged with Anabaptists. Yes, very similar, yeah.
Could you repeat please about what percentage of Amish make their living from farming?
It's about, nationwide, about 15%.
And would you know, like for people Amish who are diversifying, doing more wood projects, repair, there's non-Amish people that have Amish people come and work on their homes. Do you know how those connections are made?
So that non-Amish employers have Amish crews kind of come. It's basically through advertisements. You know, it's kind of thing where it's like, and word of mouth. I mean, they'll advertise businesses like in, for example, like penny saver type publications, and they're Amish like newsletters and publications that sometimes, and they put like posters up in certain areas, but a lot of their business is word of mouth. Yeah. So it's like, oh, my neighbor's got a new roof. Who did it? These Amish guys. It was $10,000 cheaper than the estimate I got. Okay, sounds good. And it is quite cheap because they're not cheap, but it's cheaper than what you would get from a lot of other places. Yeah. Scott?
Mark, given how important family is to Amish, when somebody gets to that age where they've got to be baptized, or when they make the decision to leave, you hear about excommunication and shunning as being very harsh. Like that individual leaves and loses connection to their family. Is it really that much of a closed door if they decide to leave the community? I can't imagine that would be possible given how tightly connected.
So shunning is something that's only practiced for people who were baptized and left under very unfortunate circumstances. So just leaving is not going to be, you're not going to be permanently shunned. And even if you're shunned, that does not mean that you don't have any contact with the people anymore. It's just that you don't, for example, transact business with them, or you can do favors for them for free, but they cannot pay you, right? So for example, let's say somebody who is formerly Amish who is still shunned, which is not, there are very, very few people in this category. But let's say they drive trucks or vans or something like that. An Amish person could not hire that or would not ride in a van or a truck with a shunned person operating it. If you leave before you're baptized, there's no shunning because you're not violating any church rules. So the status of people that either left before or left after, shunned or not shunned, and most who leave after may be shunned for a little bit, but even then it's temporary, and then it's not a like never talk to them again. Blood is thicker than water, right? And so every Amish family has at least one close relative, and probably many who are not Amish, right? And think about, like at the end of the 19th century, it said that there were 2/3 of the Amish left and became Mennonites, and there was that 1/3 core. Going back in the 1950s, it was about 50-50. So 50% of kids born to Amish parents made the decision to leave. So then it's become much more uncommon. Part of the reason for that is that in the old days, the difference between being Amish and non-Amish was not all that great, right? Like, the technology differences were not great, and that kind of thing. The difference between being Amish and non-Amish is pretty big today, right? And so when you make a decision to leave, it's a big step, right? And it's something that, a lot of people think that they just don't want to do, right? They feel sad about that. And especially as people get older, it's one thing to be in your 20s and think you want more privacy and me time and that sort of thing. But when you get to be in your 50s and 60s and 70s, you think about it's like, I really wish somebody would come by and visit me. I really wish somebody would just kind of like knock on the door and come in. There's not a whole lot of private space in a lot of Amish homes. And this is one thing that's very striking to outsiders. I was once with some older Mennonites actually in a stream of buggies going to church. And we're going down the road, and the guy that I was riding with, his brother-in-law and his family were riding in the buggy in front of us, and we were almost to the meeting house. They meet in meeting houses. And all of a sudden he sees the buggy turning off into another older Mennonite home on the lane on the farm before the church meeting house. And he thought, well, why is he pulling off here? He should be going all the way to church. And it's like, if he has to use the bathroom, they have bathrooms there or something like that. And so we were just kind of puzzled. And then they eventually, pulled out, and then he went into the house, then got out, and then went back to church. And so we asked him later, what did you do? And he says, well, I was getting up to church and I realized that I hadn't shaved. Right up here, and he said, and so I thought I'd better shave. And so we just went in to the nearest house and grabbed the guy's razor, shaved quickly, got back in the buggy and went to church. And wouldn't even think to mention it, right? Because it's like, it's just what you do. Right? All right. Yeah, Scott, go ahead.
So, as important as religion is, though, why no churches? Why did they need it? Neighbors' farms and move around?
Very clear historical reason. In the old days, they were meeting in secret. They were meeting in caves, in barns, in the woods. There are places you can go in Switzerland to this day that were known as Anabaptist hideouts, right? And it's actually some beautiful, like caves in the woods and that sort of thing, where they actually had to meet in secret because they would be persecuted, in some cases arrested. I've been to a Swiss farm that in the 1970s, where they knew that it had been occupied by Anabaptists. Anabaptists had left many, many years before that. And the family was doing some renovations. And in Switzerland, they have it's beautiful, these house barns, right? Sort of built in an L. So you've got the living quarters and the barn sort of attached to one another. And they were doing some remodeling, and all of a sudden, they discovered that in the barn part of it, that there was sort of like a false floor. And they found that there was a secret room down there. And that was not for worship, but that was for hiding. And it was well known. There were a number of, most of the, Anabaptists were always a minority. And there were people that were known as Anabaptist catchers, right? They were essentially like slave catchers that would go, and there was a bounty on Anabaptists, right? And many Anabaptist men were enslaved, right? And sold off to galleys in the Mediterranean. Kids were taken from their parents. It's horrible, horrible things that happened to these Anabaptist families. And so sympathetic neighbors would have like whistles or calls or something like that to warn them. And then the family is just like in, like runaway slaves, right? And then they would hide in these spots. And this was one of those so-called Anabaptist hiding spots. And that farm has now been turned into like a sort of a living museum because of the whole Anabaptist tradition. So.
I'm gonna keep asking questions if you let me,
Okay.
but so that level of persecution, the Anabaptists were not, they were trying to purify the existing religion, right? Why
No.
were they viewed as?
They were not trying to purify their neighbors. It was hard enough for them to live in conformity with their values and stay alive. That's why the Amish have really done almost no missionary work. The closest thing that they get to missionary work is making donations to mission groups, including that group of 17 people in Haiti. Those are progressive Amish and traditional Mennonites. Did you know that? Those 17 people that were kidnapped now going on like 3 weeks ago in Haiti. Christian Aid Ministries from Ohio is a traditional Mennonite progressive Amish group. 3 months is the youngest, up to somewhere in the 40s, I think. It's like 16 Americans and 1 Canadian. And the Amish support groups like that, and they say, you know, people are suffering all over the world, and Haiti has been one particular interest for a lot of Anabaptists. Another thing that the Amish do is go for hurricane relief. So if you go to places like New Orleans after Katrina and stuff, there were Amish and Mennonites going down there, you know, by the van load and helping to rebuild down there. So in other communities, they serve actually like in the volunteer fire departments, and there are EMTs or even Amish EMTs in other states. And so, you know, there's a lot of witnessing to the outside world, but not this idea. They say, like this one guy told me, he says, why would I go to, you know, the other side of the world to try and do missionary work when I can't even get my neighbor to go to church? Right? And so they see it's a lot better. They say what's called, let's let our light shine, just not in somebody's eyes. And so they don't, you know, like hand out literature and tracts and that sort of thing. They don't go door to door. They're willing to talk about their faith. They're definitely willing to talk about their faith and share it, but they don't feel that it's practical to try and quote unquote force it on others. They say it's by their sort of model. That's how they do it. Yes?
A couple of weeks ago, I saw an Amish woman who had no buttons on her clothing. She had pins to hold it all together. And what would lead you to be as a button is considered technology? Why would they be across the line?
That's more just kind of like the inertia of tradition, but there's a practicality about it. They say that, so for example, she was wearing a cape dress. And cape dresses they consider it more efficient to be able to do things with pins because you can adjust things as you need to, especially if you're going to be pregnant, postpartum, that sort of thing. So dresses can be expanded or contracted very, very easily, much more easily if you have pins rather than buttons that are fixed into that. So that's one practical thing. The other thing also about the cape is that it's possible, they may often have snaps underneath, and that makes it efficient for nursing. Right? But then they have the cape on top of that. But straight pins are considered much more efficient. I know that it sounds very, very difficult for outsiders to think about, but it's just amazing how these women are able to do a lot of things with pins. For many years, I've often, you know, taken Amish people on vacations and driving and stuff like that. I have to be very careful in the car when they leave. I'm going to find some straight pins in the back seat somewhere because they do sort of come out. But it's not that buttons are bad, but it's just a lot easier to make the clothing smaller or larger if you do it with pins. So, yes.
And it's almost more of an observation, but it seems almost paradoxical to me that the most Amish live in the United States, where, you know, we have so much violence, so much materialism, et cetera, that temptation might be higher here than other parts of the world. And is there any likelihood that some people might want to relocate in a different country? I was surprised to hear that was only North America.
That's an excellent question. I've never had that question, and there's a good answer for that. You can think about other countries around the world where the living standard is quite high and the happiness indexes are off the charts, like Scandinavia. But Scandinavia is incredibly rigid in terms of like the rules and regulations about a lot of things having to do with daily living. First and foremost with education. Most advanced countries of the world do not allow people to homeschool. Now, most Amish don't homeschool, but they do want curricular autonomy or educational autonomy. And so basically, it's a kind of Wild West in terms of education in North America. Yes, anything goes, and sometimes that anything goes works to their benefit. So that, and in places like, for, Germans would say, there's no way we could have Amish here because we would not allow those buggies to be on our roads, right? And it's true. I mean, it's like, and why would you not have electricity? Everybody's supposed to have electricity. There is a lot of conformity in these other societies, including Scandinavia, right? Which is, again, very, very happy, but it's a very, very regimented society, very homogenous society. There's not a lot of diversity there. And I'm not just talking about racial ethnic diversity, but I'm talking about in terms of lifestyle. Now, there are some Amish that have said, I really want to get away from government laws in the United States and Canada. And they have moved to first to Mexico. And there are some Mennonites that live just over the border in Chihuahua in Mexico, and some in Belize, and some down in South America. The problem is that they can sort of get away from it all in a lot of places, and they'll say, they'll say, well, I'm going there where there are no laws to intrude on me. And then another Amish person will say, and there are no laws to protect you. And so what has happened is that a lot of Amish have moved to these places, or not a lot, but those that have moved there have often found it's like, it's a little bit too much of a free-for-all here. And so, for example, the Mennonites in northern Mexico have extreme problems with kidnappings because of the drug dealing, the drug cartels, because they're seen as wealthy people, right, who are easy targets, whose families will probably pay ransoms, and they do, right? So there are no Amish left in northern Mexico. There are a handful in Belize, which is relatively stable, and a tiny group that's in Argentina. But some have tried to live like in Bolivia and places like that, and they realize it's like, there's not enough economic infrastructure there too. They really depend on things like, I need the gas guy to call, to come out. I call him, he's gonna be out here. I'm gonna have the semi come and take my furniture and this sort of thing. The whole economic infrastructure is something that works quite well here. And it's a little bit hit or miss in some of these other countries. And so the grass is really not greener for them in other places, but that's an excellent question. Right, I'm seeing that we're actually fairly over the time that Summer had kind of set aside, so I don't want people to feel like you're really kind of trapped here, but I want to thank you so much for coming out this evening. It was really nice for you to be here.